I knew he didn't care about me, but I didn't realize just how little I meant to him until that night. It started like any other. He came home late, drunk. But this time, instead of passing out on the couch, he grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the door.
Come on, we're going somewhere to make you finally useful.
I didn't question him. I knew better than to resist. He dragged me outside. I didn't realize something was wrong until we reached a warehouse on the outskirts of town. He pushed the door open, revealing a group of men inside. They turned when they saw us, their eyes settling on me. One of them smiled. I took a scared step back, but my father's grip tightened.
She's all yours.
My stomach dropped. My heart slammed against my ribs as I watched him extend his hand. The tallest man in the group pulled out a wad of cash, slapping it into my father's palm. My father took it without hesitation. Then, without looking at me, he turned and walked away. My father sold me off. Love never lived in our house. My parents weren't just toxic to me, they were toxic to each other. I never saw a moment of kindness between them, never saw them hold hands or even share a look that wasn't filled with resentment. They didn't love me, but they sure as hell didn't love each other either. They fought like enemies, trapped in a war neither of them could escape. Screaming matches in the kitchen, shattered plates on the floor, doors slammed so hard the walls shook. It was a routine, something as normal as eating dinner or brushing my teeth. But the worst part? They cheated. On each other. Openly. My mother had her dates. Men she dressed up for while I sat on the couch quietly, knowing better than to ask questions. She'd walk past me in her tightest dress, adjusting her lipstick in the mirror like she was heading out for a party.
Don't wait up, kid.
She never bothered to lie. My father didn't care. He never stopped her, never asked her where she was going, because he was just as bad. He brought women home. Different ones, some younger than her, some barely older than me. I remember one night in particular. I was 10. I sat at the table, staring at my untouched dinner while my mother yelled at him.
At least I have the decency to leave the house. You bring your whores here?
And? What are you gonna do about it?
She grabbed the glass from his hand and threw it against the wall. I flinched as it shattered, but he just laughed.
There's more where that came from.
That night, she stormed out of the house, and he pulled some woman onto his lap right in front of me.
Get used to it, kid.
I wanted to disappear. To shrink so small I'd vanish completely. But there was no escaping them. My mother's lovers weren't better. Some of them looked at me too long, their eyes lingering in ways that made my stomach twist. I avoided being alone with them, but my mother didn't care. She was too busy trying to make my father jealous, too busy pretending she was still young and desirable. And my father, he kept drinking, kept bringing women into our house, never once considering how it felt for his daughter to wake up to strangers at the breakfast table. I knew I was an unwanted child. My parents never hid it. They weren't the type to hold back insults or pretend to love me when others were around. They made it clear that I was the reason their lives were miserable. The reason my father drowned himself in bottles every night. The reason my mother's dreams never came true. My earliest memories weren't bedtime stories or warm hugs. They were slammed doors and shattered glass. My mother screaming about how she never wanted a child. My father shouting that I ruined everything.
I should have had an abortion. You forced me to keep her.
And what did that get me? A nagging, cheating wife and a useless kid.
They always threatened to leave. I was the dead weight they carried, the burden neither of them wanted. My mother would pack a suitcase, stand at the door, and glare at me.
One day, I'll walk out and I won't come back.
My father would laugh, slumped in his chair, half a bottle in his grip.
Go on then. Do us both a favor.
But she never left. Not yet. Instead, she lashed out. She blamed me for everything from her wrinkles, her wasted youth, to the fact that she never became the woman she wanted to be.
I should be living in a mansion, traveling the world. But no, I'm stuck here because of you.
And my father? He blamed me too. But his anger was quieter, more dangerous. He'd drink until his hands shook, then look at me with dead, empty eyes.
If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be like this. I hate how useless you are to me.
I learned to keep quiet, to make myself invisible. I stopped asking for things, stopped trying to make them love me, because they didn't. They never would. Then, the divorce happened. It wasn't shocking. They'd spent years hating each other, and I guess they finally had enough. My mother stood by the door, her suitcase in hand, just like she always said she would be.
I'm not taking her with me. I refuse to take a liability.
You're taking her. She's your child. If you won't take responsibility, you're not going to force me to do it.
She's my child. Well, guess what? I carried her for 9 whole months and looked after her with you for 15 years. It's your turn to do whatever you want with her.
They argued back and forth like that, like I wasn't standing right there, like I wasn't a person, just a problem to be tossed between them.
I've wasted enough years because of her. I am not taking her.
And that was it. My mother walked out the door, never looking back. I watched her leave, knowing she was free. Free from me. I thought my father might soften after that. Maybe he'd step up now that it was just the two of us. Maybe without her around, he'd finally see me. But I was wrong. Now there was no one else to blame, no one else to take his anger. So it all fell on me. Life with my father was worse. My mother may have abandoned me, but at least she never laid a hand on me. My father? He was a storm waiting to strike, and I was always in the way. He hit me for everything. If I spoke too loudly, if I didn't answer quickly enough, if he was in a bad mood, his fist was already swinging before I could even brace for impact. Sometimes I didn't even know what I had done wrong.
You think you can talk to me like that?
I never knew what like that meant. He was drunk more often than he was sober, stumbling into the house with the stench of alcohol clinging to his clothes. When he didn't have money for beer, he took it out on me. And money was always a problem. School became a distant memory, not because I didn't want to go, because he couldn't be bothered to pay the little fees.
Why the hell should I waste money on you? You're already a burden.
At first, I kept asking. Every few weeks, I'd gather the courage to bring it up, hoping he'd come to his senses. He didn't. One day, I asked again. That was my biggest mistake because I shouldn't have.
Are you still on about that?
I barely had time to answer before his hands were around my throat. He shoved me against the wall, squeezing so tight I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, my lungs screamed for air, and for a moment, I thought he was going to kill me. Then, he let go. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping. He didn't even look at me as he grabbed his jacket and left the house. I stopped asking after that. I stopped hoping. Hunger gnawed at my stomach constantly because he barely fed me. When he did, it was scraps. Leftovers he didn't want. Some days, I went to bed with nothing but water. I knew he didn't care about me, but I didn't realize just how little I meant to him until that night. It started like any other. He came home late, drunk. But this time, instead of passing out on the couch, he grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the door.
Come on, we're going somewhere to make you finally useful.
I didn't question him. I knew better than to resist. He dragged me outside. I didn't realize something was wrong until we reached a warehouse on the outskirts of town. He pushed the door open, revealing a group of men inside. They turned when they saw us, their eyes settling on me. One of them smiled. I took a scared step back, but my father's grip tightened.
She's all yours.
My stomach dropped. My heart slammed against my ribs as I watched him extend his hand. The tallest man in the group pulled out a wad of cash, slapping it into my father's palm. My father took it without hesitation. Then, without looking at me, he turned and walked away. My father sold me off. I was handled roughly and tied to a chair. There were other kids around who were crying. The men didn't care. They laughed, drank, and counted their money like we weren't even there. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't afraid. I was. But I refused to give them the satisfaction. My father had already sold me off like trash. I wasn't about to let these men see me break. Then, fortune smiled upon me. There were sounds of gunshots, doors being kicked open. I knew it was the cops when the traffickers started panicking. Some of the men grabbed their guns, trying to fight back, but the cops were faster. Some traffickers were killed, others tried to run, were taken down. They were arrested, and the officers came to free us.
You're safe now, kids. We've got you.
Unfortunately, not all of the traffickers were caught. The leader was nowhere to be found. I spent 2 days in police custody. They fed me, gave me clean clothes, and tried to comfort me. When they asked for my father's number, I gave it to them. They called, but he didn't pick up. When they took me to his house, expecting answers, we found him barely alive. There was blood all around him. Apparently, the leader of the traffickers had found him. He thought my father had snitched on him because the cops stormed the building barely 30 minutes after I was sold, so he became suspicious. He took back the money my father had received for selling me, but since my father had already spent some of it, he shot him twice in the arm. The cops rushed him to the hospital, but I didn't feel sad for him. I wished he died. They treated his wounds, but the damage was too severe. His arm was paralyzed. When he was stable enough, they arrested him.
Selling your own child? You disgust me.
He was taken to court first and got sentenced to 10 years. He cried and pleaded for my forgiveness, but I spat on him, telling him I'll never forgive him even in death. I was placed in an orphanage since my mother never came for me even after they managed to get a hold of her and told her what happened. 2 weeks later, the leader of the traffickers was caught. His fellow traffickers and him all faced trial, receiving life imprisonment as their punishment. For me, life moved on. A year later, on my 16th birthday, a couple walked into the orphanage. They saw me and wanted me. It felt good to be chosen for the first time in my life. They were kind people. They treated me like glass. They gave me the love I had never known. I finished high school in their care, growing stronger every day. Then, my mom showed up. She was unrecognizable, looking skinny and scrawny. My adoptive parents asked her what she wanted after she introduced herself, and I was shocked at her reply.
I have HIV. You have to help me since you have my daughter.
She didn't come for me. She came for money. So greedy. My adoptive parents refused her.
You abandoned her. You don't get to come back now and be all entitled, get lost and never show your face here again.
But she wouldn't stop. She stalked me, lurked outside my school, and followed me home. I ignored her until I couldn't anymore. She cornered me one night, screaming, demanding and clawing at me like a rabid animal. When I couldn't take it anymore, I hit her. I hit her with all my pent-up anger until she fainted. Then I called the cops. She was arrested, given a year in prison, but she only lasted 6 months before she died. Quite a sad way to end her life, but who cares? Definitely not me.